Hello, I'm Lynn Shannon, University of Cape Town. I'm unable to be with you today, but I'm very grateful to be able to record something for you. I'm going to give you a very, very quick insight into how we are using our ecosystem models to look at climate change effects in the South African marine ecosystems. And this is with a view to encourage fisheries management that is adaptive. We've been developing 3 different Ecospace models. On the left, you'll see our larger Southern Benguela Ecospace model domain in the blue, which goes from the Namibian border all the way around to the Eastern Cape. And then, sorry, on the right, you'll see in green, this is Samantha Graz. She's one of my PhD students. She's developing an Ecospace model of the South Coast, specifically to look at top predators and sharks. And then Kelly, who you know very well from this project, is developing an Ecospace model of the Algoa Bay ecosystem to feed into the whole MSP project. So the kinds of output that we obtain from our Ecospace models look something like this, where we have the relative biomass on the left and relative catch on the right, distributions of the different functional groups. And this specific snapshot was taken in 2015 because we were modeling using our EcoSim spatial model from 1978 and then using the fishing efforts that we have for the period 78 to 2015 for 28 fleets to drive the model over that period. And we used our temperature from Earth system models, GFDL model, the pelagic or kind of surface temperature and the bottom temperature to drive what is happening in some of our functional groups where we know that the temperature really determines where they are and how well they are doing. So it's a habitat capacity model, and we're using here temperature to look at those changes and responses within the ecosystem, as well as fishing. So here we've taken the Southern Benguela Ecospace model, and we have driven it into the future using outputs from the GFDL Earth system model in terms of the temperatures at the ocean bottom and in the top part of the water column, as well as primary production estimates into the future. And we've looked at 2 different scenarios. So here we've looked at the, in orange, the high emission scenario, and in blue, the low emission scenario. And then we've looked at what's happening with some of our indicators. So you'll see just quickly on the graph at the top there, the catch is lower under high emissions into the future. This goes up to 2,100. The trophic level of the catch is higher, which means that we are taking more larger and predatory species. If you have a look in the middle there, you'll see the demersal to pelagic catch ratio is showing us that there's a larger portion of demersal fish in the catch projected into the future here. And this is because if you have a look on the right, our forage fish, our small pelagics, our anchovy and our sardine, are declining to lower levels when we have high emission scenarios and when we have the low emission scenarios. And this has implications for our predators, in particular something like the endangered African penguin, which you can see right at the bottom, where the decline is worsened under a high emission scenario. So these are the kinds of things that we are exploring using our models. But we get a huge amount of information from these kinds of models, and what we really need to do is synthesize this information in the form of indicators. So this is a framework which has been developed by Emma Lockerbie, and we've taken ecological indicators, be they database, be they model-based, in this case model-based, and we've looked at how these change over time under different fishing pressure or under different fishing scenarios. So here we're really focusing on the fishing impacts within an ecosystem, but I wanted to show you how the climate comes in. So we then look and we say, well, given the fishing pressure that we've either observed or are projecting into the future, to what extent is it likely that the indicators are responding to the fishing pressure or to something else? And we then weight the scores of those indicators accordingly. So we'll give them higher weighting in this case if fishing pressure is the main driver. We then look at the environmental context. So what the environment's doing has a huge influence on what we're observing together with the fishing. And if the environment is the main driver in what we think we're observing in our trends in our ecological indicators, then we downweight those indicators because we're really looking at the impacts of fishing in this specific framework. But one could change that depending what your aim is. And anyway, you may happily go and read the paper, but just to say, we then come out with a score and we synthesize information into an ecosystem status assessment. So we try to categorize ecosystems in terms of, are they improving? Are they deteriorating? Are things going along relatively normally? And then this information is what we can then give to the decision makers, to the managers, to the stakeholders. So what we did was we took our EcoSim model. So this was not using the spatial model at the time. We were using our temporally dynamic model. And we looked at what would happen if we had a period of higher productivity projected into the future. And this was given that it's possibly likely or possible that upwelling may be increasing in the future. So therefore our primary productivity would increase. We did a number of calculations on amounts and things. And we then projected, we ran the model and we looked at what are the indicators, the biomass, the proportion of predators in our community, the trophic levels of the community, of the catch, the actual catch, what are those doing? And we, in this specific graph on the left, I'm just showing you the analyses using ANOVA of what we observed in the last 10 years for 5 different scenarios. So first we have the baseline plain business as usual scenario. Then we have the increased prime productivity scenario with fishing as we had in 2015, carrying on those kind of levels. Then we had an increased fishing on the prey species into the future, the scenario in red there, increased fishing on our predators and increased fishing on both predators and prey at the same time under this in this more productive ecosystem. And we looked at what would be the most feasible in terms of our ecosystem categorization. And what we found is, third from the left on those graphs on the left, is that the increased fishing on prey would give us an ecosystem which would be possibly improving, definitely not deteriorating, and could be considered in the future. Whereas our increased fishing, for example, on predators and prey, which is your far right scenario, your fifth one, we were finding that the ecosystem was possibly suggesting that there would be possible deterioration of the ecosystem functioning and therefore we put a warning sign into that kind of assessment. So very quickly, my key messages. Ecosystem models can be useful to explore ecosystem changes that result from climate change and to look at the implications of these for fisheries. And we can use different climate models. We can use simple productivity estimates based on data to provide input to our marine ecosystem models and to really explore the ranges, the possible ranges of the ecosystem effects of climate change, both in time and now in space with these new spatial models. But we really do, as I said, need to consolidate the information into something that's useful. And this is done in the way of using indicators, both ecological, ecosystem state, configuration, ecosystem functioning, and socioeconomic indicators such as how much catch or how much biomass is there, therefore how much catch are we likely to be able to take, and where are we likely to be able to take that catch. That's really important. So the spatial aspect again coming in there. But then even with all this information, we still have multiple indicators and they're not always showing us the same kind of trend. So what do we do with that? We need a framework, as I've explained in the previous few slides, to combine this information to come up with assessments and spatial projections that actually can be communicated to our decision makers. So all in all, what's new? Well, we had some spatial temporal models of our ecosystem previously, but they were not as detailed in terms of functional groups and they were not as spatially explicit. So this is new, and the Ecospace modeling approach applied in our region is also is new. And then I just wanted to highlight again that the FishMIP participating in that, and you can read a little bit more about that. There's a lot about that. And that's something that we really are putting the Southern Benguela and the South African cases into the global projections. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.
Hi everyone, so my name is Ishti Vermeulen and I'll be telling you a little bit more about some of the systems analysis and system dynamics modeling work that we've been doing in Ecospace, South Africa. So a lot of our work is in order to inform and support the national marine spatial planning process. This is currently ongoing, and it's a complex process which entails managing the spatial and temporal complexity of different marine uses in the ocean space in order to ensure that they're functioning sustainably and meeting those complex socio-ecological objectives. And we are currently hosting the pilot project, the Algoa Bay project. And in the Algoa Bay project, we're developing a range of products and tools to inform and support marine spatial planning. One of these tools that was developed is the Algoa Marine Systems Analysis tool. So Algoa MSAT is an exploratory systems model to support integrated ocean management, particularly marine spatial planning. And it does so by measuring sustainable management across different sectors in the bay and aims to capture interconnections amongst sectors through the method of system dynamics modeling. So why did we choose system dynamics modeling? And the reason is it's because it stems from the broad realm of systems thinking, which is a holistic approach that focuses on a way that systems parts interrelate and how systems work over time and within the context of larger systems. So system dynamics modeling is specifically the quantitative method that it orders us to model these interactions over time. So in order to develop the model, we hosted a small stakeholder engagement process, which was called the Algoa Bay Collaborative Dynamic Modeling Process. And the aim of the process was particularly to engage with stakeholders to ask them, what their planning visions are in the different sectors and what they would like to see in the model. So we hosted in different stages where we first met with different stakeholders from sectors individually, and thereafter we held a very small pilot multi-sectoral workshop. So this entailed meeting with stakeholders from governments as well as from the different marine sectors included in the model. So this is just a holistic overview of the model structure, and it aims to capture the main dynamics that are represented in the model. So it basically shows that within the land-based discharge sector, the main variables of interest was specifically how trends in household litter is changing over time, how trends in wastewater discharge is changing, and this is relevant to changing population growth in the bay. And so on, we investigated different outputs in the different sectors. So for example, in the shipping sector, we specifically focused on vessel visits, vessel traffic, port efficiency, etc. In terms of the fishing sector, we investigated changes in the sardine biomass relative to catch efforts. In tourism, we looked at tourism attractiveness, accommodation occupancy, and so on. And then eventually we integrated all these outputs in terms of the sustainable indicators, measured specifically in terms of marine wealth and marine health, and thereby identified different trade-offs of these outputs under different model scenarios. So this was the scenario matrix that we developed to support scenario planning in the model. And essentially you have these two axes. On the far right corner, we have the Sea of Plenty scenario, which essentially represents, this balance or achieving the balance between marine health and marine wealth and labor. And in the bottom left, we have what's called the dead man's chess, where we neither achieved our marine health. Well, we neither achieved our marine health goals, nor did we achieve marine wealth or marine labor. So we investigated these four extreme scenarios by changing the dynamics in the model and simulated these dynamics over a 40-year time period. So it was interesting to see how different changes in different sectors, how different policies, management interventions in different sectors could achieve these different scenarios over time. And in order to complement the model, we developed the online visual user interface. So this allows the model to be accessible to stakeholders, to decision makers, so that they can use the model and further conduct additional scenario planning in a multi-sectoral planning setting. So the scenario runs where you have an interface for each different sector, and you have different policies and interventions to tweak and run respective model scenarios. So what was the significance? It was really to explore these different policy interventions and identify trade-offs between multiple competing and conflicting sectoral uses. It allowed our stakeholders to also gain a shared understanding of the system and identify pathways needed to achieve these management goals. It allowed us to assist integrated ocean management and marine spatial planning, essentially inform or hopefully inform implementation in South Africa. And the main goal was to achieve these healthy and resilient oceans to sustain our human needs. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of the funding institutions, which included the Coastal Marine Research and the One Ocean Hub. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing great. So Nina and I are going to present on our research, which is titled Integrating Indigenous and Local Knowledge in Ocean Governance or marine spatial planning, where we're focusing on Algoa Bay. So the problem, as many of you know, climate change often affects people who do live along the coast and on the coast and are sustained by the coast and the ocean. And what we need is to somehow include more cultural knowledge and perspectives and connections in social sustainability research and in ocean governance research more broadly. There's a need to include indigenous and local knowledge systems and local knowledge in marine spatial planning and area-based ocean governance. And there's lack of research on how to actually include more cultural and spiritual connections and values of the oceans and the coast. Another problem is how then to pin these cultural values on a map, as we might hear from policymakers or researchers that if it's not in GIS or in Excel, it's not usable. And what we need to look at and how we actually spatialize cultural values for use in marine spatial planning. Next. Let's see.
Sorry, Mia, I'm having trouble. There we go. Sorry.
All good. So what this research project is exploring is looking at indigenous and local knowledge systems existing in Algoa Bay. And it's taking a social ecological systems approach, seeing that we're all connected and how the cultural values also really make part of the social ecological system that we're in. So the project is specifically working with subsistence fishers, bait collectors, Khoisan representatives, sangomas, recreational users, and learners, because we've seen that they've been excluded from the knowledge production process. And it's exploring cultural connections to the ocean and coast and talking to people who are actually experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand. Next. So the approach that we've been taking is something called arts-based participatory research methods, and we're specifically using storytelling and photography through smartphones to make it more accessible. We've had workshops in how to take photos and how to tell a story through audio recording, and together we've come to practice social learning and, more importantly, unlearning to different ways of knowing the ocean and the coast and how these might come together. What's been really useful is art's possibility of imagining alternative futures, which is really important when you're working with people who have historically been excluded from the ocean and the coast. And what we will do in the next few months is to have an exhibition to showcase these knowledges through the photos and the stories that the co-researchers have provided.
Thank you so much, Mia. Hello, everyone. Okay, so while Mia is working sort of on the ground grassroots level to identify what indigenous and local knowledge is in the Bay, what I'm doing is sort of working from the top. And we've seen that there's a lot of literature that says, oh, we need to capacitate grassroots, coastal communities, but actually decision makers and implementing authorities also really need to be capacitated. So one of the first things that we're doing is through interviews and one-on-one engagements with managers and implementing authorities and decision makers were identifying their knowledge needs and sort of the levers to be able to integrate this kind of knowledge. So, what is the knowledge that they need in terms of, the indigenous and local knowledge out there? How does it need to be packaged, or like in what format does it have to be in? And so, yeah, this is sort of what we're exploring. Then the next thing is that Mia was talking about having an art exhibition at the end of, that's culminating at the end of her research. And then what we're going to be doing is invite coastal managers to come to that art exhibition and engage with people's local knowledge around the bay. And then after that, we'll have a workshop with local communities and the coastal managers to really identify pathways or levers to integrate this knowledge. And then one of the other things we're also doing is using participatory community mapping. We'll do this next year with local communities in the bay to map places of cultural significance. So again, this is working with marine spatial planning. Knowledge has to be spatialized, which is problematic in and of itself. And we are grappling with that. But like we've been told by, spatial managers, if it's not in an Excel sheet or on a map, they can't really use it. And then just some of the key climate messages that are coming out for us is that different knowledge systems do need to inform climate change mitigation and adaptation. Why is this? Climate change needs to respond to it needs to be contextualized, and it needs to be contextualized so it can respond to the realities of people who are actually seeing climate change on a first-hand basis and experiencing it. And then the how is really using participatory collaborative methodologies to gain a deeper understanding of people's lives, and then to together explore creative solutions to the issues presented by climate change. And then also another thing lastly is just the need for social learning or change-oriented learning, because in order to be adaptive, you need to keep on learning. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thanks everyone. So I'm going to be talking about, can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about how vulnerability assessments can inform adaptation planning in the context of climate change in coastal communities in the Benguela current large marine ecosystem. This is work that I've been involved in with colleagues over the past 5 years, but it's ongoing in certain areas under the One Ocean Hub work that I'm involved in. So as heard already, small-scale fishing communities are particularly vulnerable, and this is due to their geographic locations, often in low-lying areas. We also know that they're very often amongst the poorest, very weak socioeconomic circumstances, and many of these communities rely on fish for food security and for livelihoods. And we also know that many of them have low capacity to adapt to these shocks and stresses that they experience due to climate change. So understanding the vulnerability of these communities is important for us to develop appropriate actions and adaptation strategies that can build resilience. So basically, in terms of the work that I'll be presenting, and this is really just an absolute snapshot of it, and it's work that I've been doing with Serge Raimaitis from the NPO Abelobi in South Africa, from colleagues at the University of Namibia, and also from the NGO Development Workshop in Angola, where we've been working in 15 communities over the last 5 years, and where we've implemented a rapid community-based vulnerability assessment methodology to understand the effects of climate change on coastal livelihoods, and where we've been exploring possible adaptation strategies and looking at the adaptive capacity required to reduce vulnerability and build resilience. And then based on the outcomes of these vulnerability assessments, have developed community-based adaptation plans. So I'm going to focus particularly on the community-based adaptation plans that emanate from the vulnerability assessments. So just looking at the community level vulnerability assessments, And we've heard from Mia and Nina now about the importance of hearing community voices and exploring this local and indigenous knowledge. And this is precisely what this community-based vulnerability assessment seeks to do. Essentially what we do over a 2-day period in a workshop setting of about 25 participants is to really try and understand from local communities themselves who are working in marine environments on a day-to-day basis about the threats and stresses they experience in general terms, but also in particular from environmental changes and climate changes, to hear about to learn about their observations and experiences, and to learn about their perceptions of change. Also how they're coping with these changes and what adaptation strategies they're employing and what they consider to be appropriate and feasible in their particular context. And then also what support they need in order to implement the strategies that they consider to be feasible. So as I mentioned, we take people through a 2-day workshop process, and I obviously don't have time to go into the details of this process, but essentially we've developed it, we've tested it, and we've applied it now in over 15 communities, and we've also trained various NGOs and government officials to utilize this process. But starting with a village mapping exercise through to identifying threats and stresses, to really mapping and exploring the kind of changing environmental conditions that communities and fishers are experiencing and the impacts that this creates for them, as well as understanding the institutions that they work with and support them. We then move to understanding their coping and adaptation strategies. And more details of this methodology can be found in the references provided below. But essentially, the rapid vulnerability assessment culminates in identifying these strategies. And of course, these can be a variety of strategies, but very often we find a lot of them are around improving local level organizations, strengthening these institutions, improving, for example, access to the internet for getting better information around weather forecasts, and supplementary livelihoods. Some of these strategies might be immediate, such as training. Others are much more long-term, such as exploring alternative livelihoods or supplementary livelihoods. Now, based on the information derived from the community-based vulnerability assessment, we can now move to fleshing out the ideas and the actions and the strategies that communities identified in these vulnerability assessment workshops to work with them to develop locally appropriate adaptation plans. What is important in this context is to identify a facilitator. Very often, what's really useful is having a local champion, and then, of course, involving the community in these workshops and meetings and ensuring that there's a good feedback mechanism, because obviously this isn't a once-off workshop, but this is an ongoing iterative process between the facilitators or the researchers, if they're the ones doing the facilitating as we were, and the community. So the purpose of the adaptation planning phase is to ascertain, based on what culminated in the vulnerability assessments, is the strategies and actions that communities identified. Which of these need to be prioritized? And what information do we need in order to develop these actions and strategies into workable plans? Who can assist us? What role can be played by government, by the private sector, by NGOs, by research agencies and researchers? And then what is the role of the community? What actions do they need to play to progress this adaptation plan? What capacity and skills do they require? What resources do they require? And where do we need to get these resources from? The adaptation planning process takes place in a workshop setting as well. It's guided by a table of questions, very similar to the ones I've just been through, but fleshed out in quite a lot more detail. And the idea is that based on an initial workshop, the researchers then go and gather further information, which then gets fed back to the community, who then build on that information until basically you've got a kind of a solid understanding of what is required in order to progress and implement the strategies that have been identified. This is an ongoing iterative process, and obviously working in communities, we know these can be slow processes, priorities change, And what's critically important is that these local level adaptation planning processes need to be linked into other planning processes in order to ensure that the plan that is developed can be implemented. And so it's not only about implementing these local level adaptation plans into, for example, integrated development plans or local tourism or economic development plans, but it's also about upscaling them and integrating them at the national level into national climate adaptation plans and even sector plans like fisheries sector plans. So in conclusion then, as has been mentioned, coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and it's critical that we then understand their vulnerability context, and the community vulnerability assessment methodology that I've outlined is one such tool to gather this information and to inform adaptation planning. It's useful because it helps gather community knowledge and their perceptions. It also is important because it provides an opportunity for social learning, a point also mentioned by Nina and Mia. And it also provides us opportunity to bring different knowledges together. What's important about the community-based adaptation planning is that it identifies actions and strategies that communities consider to be workable and implementable at the local level. What's important to note is these are ongoing and iterative processes. They're adaptive processes. They're certainly not once-off processes. It's a kind of a work in progress. It never ends really, but it's about finding ways to integrate the information that's gathered at this local level into local and other national sector and climate change strategies and plans. Okay, thanks very much.